All right, welcome everyone to this Friends webinar about cloud compliance and security in the ever-changing world of GDPR and data regulations here for us here in the EU. My name is Asmo Urpilainen, and I'm the Chief Product Officer for the Friends Integration Platform. And with me, I have Johan Christiansen from Cleora. And Johan, welcome. Could you introduce yourself in a couple of words?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm the founder of Cleora, and we are one of the few, I would say, European public cloud providers.
Excellent. And basically about today's topic and maybe pacing a little bit and some housekeeping here before we get started. So the webinar is planned to last for 45 minutes. We'll first do a little bit of an overview on the topic and the subject in general, and a brief introduction onto Friends itself, after which we will move over to Johan, and we'll talk a little bit about the compliant cloud and cloud compliance from Johan's perspective, and we'll have some time for Q&A in the end of the webinar. But all right, so maybe to kind of get us in tune on the topic itself, and why we here at Friends are of course now talking about this and of course talking with Johan about this, is that, well, of course, as an integration platform, data protection and data security in general are super important for us, and of course they are super important for our customers, since usually most of all organizations' data flows through the integration platform, and that basically makes it, I think, one of the most important pieces of technology to secure from this data protection perspective, since of course if something is wrong with the integration platform that has access to all of the customers' data and systems, that means that then every system will be compromised at the same time. And of course, we do of course have a big pedigree and history of implementing various types of security controls, encryptions, architectural patterns to make sure that these sorts of accidental or malicious, let's say, attempts to break into the environment of the customer won't happen. But of course, kind of you can only go so far with, let's say, technical security, and we also of course have to consider organizational security. And from this perspective, we actually came into a little bit of a problem due to these sorts of GDPR regulations and of course the Schrems 1 and 2 decision that followed, which basically stated that any American-owned organization which basically processes or stores any data that the user or customer has put into those services, such as, let's say, Microsoft Azure, can be accessed legally in the United States through, for example, the National Security Agency or NSA in certain types of situations. And of course, this is not okay and all right for us. And of course, that's why we are now here today to talk about the compliant cloud option. And in a nutshell, what this means is that what we've been able to do here at Friends is actually move all of our basically iPaaS infrastructure, so the services that make up the Friends platform and offer the integration platform to the customer, from Azure to Cleora's Swedish-based data centers. And the main point there is that ensures that we can actually be fully and completely compliant in any type of a basically GDPR perspective or situation, and interesting times to say the least. But before we actually let Johan take us a little bit deeper into the interesting world of Cleora and the compliant cloud there, in just a few words, if you are not familiar with Friends beforehand, or you haven't heard of Friends beforehand, what Friends basically is, like I mentioned, a purely browser-based integration platform as a service. So that should be a given. And what we basically can do with Friends is we can fulfill all the integration scenarios that any organization might have, including stuff from API integrations to file-based integrations, data integrations, system to system, and even this sort of full-blown business process automation, automation use cases as well. So basically, we want to be this sort of a one-stop shop for all of your integration needs, whether they be in the cloud, on-premise, whether they be modern REST APIs or legacy systems. We should got you covered. And basically, one of the main, or I would say the three main selling points or kind of value drivers for Friends is, of course, our low-code approach to kind of speed up the development of new integrations, as well as, of course, automating all of the other work besides development. So what we want to actually achieve here is this sort of a full-blown process automation from the developer's point of view, meaning that Friends will automatically have version control, deployment processes, different sorts of monitoring and security features enabled, so that then the developers and users of the platform don't have to worry about that stuff. And then we come into the third and most crucial point here. So the architecture of the platform itself, where we are actually operating in this sort of a hybrid model most often. And from a practical perspective, what this means, and of course, this is now a picture of the past, and that's why I put the Azure there in parentheses. But the ideology that we want to kind of bring to the customer, both from a functional point of view, but also from a data protection point of view, is following these distributed architecture principles, where we actually have a single centralized user interface, or basically a web application that we are calling the control panel. And the control panel is where you do all of your development work, access the monitoring data, maybe, I don't know, rerun any failed integrations or set up some sort of KPI rules, wherever, whatever, when a human or a user wants to interact with the platform, that's done through the control panel. But then the actual data that the integrations are moving, that's never actually being processed here in the control panel, but actually in what we are calling Friends agents. And here the data protection aspects comes heavily into play, because what the agent architecture or the distributed architecture allows us to do is actually bring that integration agent, the executable part of the integration platform, into whatever data center you might be utilizing right now, to basically enable those on-premise to on-premise integration use cases securely. So that actually means that the data never has to leave the on-premise environment. But of course, we do realize that not absolutely everything in the world is on an on-premise environment. So that's why we can also deploy the agents to basically any sort of a cloud service provider, and of course, including Cleora, who we are going to be, or what we're going to be talking about next. And now these two or more agents with different deployment models, depending from the private cloud to public cloud to on-premise or ground, can work together so that then we can always be aware and kind of on top of our data, because we can quite clearly define what sort of data is being processed in basically which environment, and everything is simply then controlled from that one single centralized location. And previously, this was of course quite enough for us from a security and data protection point of view, because that meant that we could still ensure that the actual data being moved by the systems never left the customer's infrastructure. But now, due to the Schrems 1 and 2 decisions and the kind of, I would say, political climate around GDPR, means that then the problem arose here in the control panel, because of course the control panel was previously now being produced in Microsoft Azure. And of course, there we have the Schrems 2 decision saying or describing the problem where the data and more especially the monitoring data could theoretically be accessed here in our Azure, even though the Azure data center is located here in Europe, but the situation still is basically the same. So now what we actually can do is that even if the agent, so the executable part, was fully compliant previously, the control panel was not. But now with Cleora's help, of course, we end up in a situation that the control panel is now running in Cleura's compliant cloud, meaning that now all components, including the executable, the agent, as well as then the control panel, are both fully GDPR and data protection compliant. And basically this results us in being this sort of a perfect competitive position, even in sense I think we are probably the first integration platform as a service provider in Europe to be able to actually provide this sort of a fully compliant solution from pretty much all GDPR perspectives. And just as a final maybe note here, so one slide about how Friends is basically working. So if we look at this slide and we have kind of established how and where we can now actually process and access the data of the customer and how we can make that environment completely compliant when dealing with that data, the way that the integrations themselves are built are always done in Friends using this sort of a quite intuitive process-based approach where we simply model out the integration use case using this sort of a BPM and 2.0 notation, or the process picture as you see it here. And the main principles behind the development is that we specify these sorts of components in the process flow, each of which produces or does some sort of a critical function or a common function to make the integration flow or the integration process work as a whole and achieve some sort of a use case, like in this case processing an invoice from an API to the ERP. But I'd say that might be enough of an introduction here from the Friends side. So we could maybe move over to Johan, and I'll have a little bit of a conversation about Cleura. But Johan, did you have your slides ready there already?
Yeah, why don't I just see if I can take over the sharing here?
Yes.
I think that should be it. I took over.
Yes, perfect. I think we can see it.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Asmo. It's certainly interesting to see, and just from experience over the last so many months here, I would say you're correct in the fact that there are very few solutions out there. There's certainly a lot of on-prem solutions when it comes to integration, but when it comes into cloud, we see a lot of demand for it because of the need for not just compliance, but of course the functionality, where integration is becoming more complex in a world where cloud, on-premise, and hybrid is becoming more and more common. So my name is Johan Christensson. I'm the founder of Cleura. We actually just changed our name from City Network to Cleura. One of the reasons for that is that we've had a strict focus on infrastructure as a service. And today we want to work even more with partners to make sure that we can deliver as high as possible up in the stack, so to speak, from the infrastructure part all the way up to the SaaS layers. Therefore, for example, the relationship here with Friends. As a company, we're a public cloud provider, but we do have a differentiator in the sense where we focus on regulatory challenged companies. And that's not just GDPR, of course. That's, it could be banks, it could be government, it could be healthcare. Today it's a fairly complex world, and the combination then that we're trying to fulfill is, of course, deliver modern infrastructure, automation, of course, and do so in combination with being able to uphold whether it's laws or regulations for various types of verticals. So before I jump into the compliance perspective here, so to speak, I wanted to actually start with a little puzzle here, which is really the reason why we're looking at this digital transformation, and we're talking about how a company needs to do take huge steps in the digital transformation. And really for us, what it comes down to is an innovation journey, right? Everything is turning digital, whether it's back-end processes or your customer meetings, so to speak. And really what we want is a higher degree of digital output, because that allows us to innovate more. Again, because most services that we produce, or frankly, anything we do today, will have some form of digital component. So the more we can produce from that perspective, we can also innovate quicker. And as the slide says there, it could be, of course, new services, but really, new models and markets and whatever it might be, so to speak, right? And real quick on that note, so we all have a digital stack, that could be SAP in the bottom and the customer meeting at the very, very top. And the difference today is, of course, that needs to move very quickly, frankly, every day. And that used to be something that was actually quite slow. We used to update maybe every 6 months, every 12 months. And today we do it much more frequently. And there, of course, integration comes in as a big part as well. The two things on the side of our digital stack that needs to change is, of course, that one, we need what we call programmable infrastructure as code. Has a lot of names, right? But the common denominator is really we need to automate. The more we can automate, the better it is, from the fact that we can produce quicker, but also bring better quality. And on the left side, there organizational change. For the large organizations out there, it's usually where the challenge lies. Everybody can go out and buy infrastructure, but making the change where you use new tools, new knowledge, and new ways of working, and above all, actually creating autonomous teams that can move very quickly is usually a little bit bigger challenge. We many times refer to this as the DevSecOps journey type of thing, right? But then, the things that we work a lot with is, of course, somehow harmonizing governance, security, and compliance. And this is actually becoming more and more complex, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we move into this. And this is where integration also becomes extremely complex, in the sense that many times when we do integration between various platforms, it's very difficult to class data and say that this is the only data that's going to go through here. All I can say is that we know things change, and normally those change will introduce other types of data from various applications. And now, of course, the integration engine must be able to take a very high level when it comes to the actual regulatory compliance aspect, so to speak. And as a company, we work very heavily with these three foundational things. We want to have an open infrastructure, meaning that open source is at the core. Compliance is something that we've been working on for a long time, and of course, sustainability, we believe, also is something that we all should take into a much bigger aspect as we move things forward today. But enough about the digital transformation and innovation journey. I mentioned that integration becomes a complex thing, in the sense that we don't necessarily know the data that's flowing all the time. And even if we do, in a large organization, it's difficult to be able to control that over time. So many times we can probably say, yes, we're compliant today, but will we be compliant tomorrow? Again, it's important to look for the infrastructure that can take you all the way up, so to speak, whatever that might be from your organization standpoint. So this is a simplified way of looking at some laws, but we divide them into 4 different layers to be able to control it, so to speak. So at the highest layer, number 1 here, we have general data laws. Osmo was talking a lot about GDPR, and frankly, most of us in Europe are touched by GDPR in one way or the other. And by the way, it's an extremely important law, because all us, the citizens, we certainly want to make sure that we can have our privacy, and as you guys have read, many countries now are taking after that, because we're all realizing the value of data, and also the harm that data can do if it gets into the wrong hands. But for example, public access to information and secrecy, normally called OSL, for example, in Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, which most European countries have, is a significant law within government as a whole, right? Which is even tougher than GDPR in many ways. So already there, you'll see 2 laws that will make it very complex, for example, for the governments of Europe to deal with. Second one is verticals. You might act in a vertical that has some form of what we call vertical specific laws. Simple ones, of course, bank secrecy and so forth, right? Healthcare Patient Data Act are things that are very commonly spoken about. But frankly, just about every instance of a vertical, so to speak, have some form of law. I had a kind of funny conversation with a social services worker where they mentioned that, wow, we cannot even adhere to our own law, the Social Services Act. When a city is, for example, having dialogues over, let's say, a tool like Teams, there could be sensitive data, could be GDPR data, and all of a sudden, you have laws like the Social Services Act that also regulates data within a city in Europe, so to speak, right? So it's broad in that sense from a vertical perspective as well. So you should know what you're being exposed to. And then most of the verticals also have EU frameworks like Basel 2.3 for banks or Solvency 2.3 for example, for insurance company. There are a bunch of these frameworks, and if you're in the auto industry or whatever it might be, most of these frameworks are really there to make sure that you as an enterprise continue to lower the risk for your customers at all times. And that frankly, from a personal perspective, this is what this comes down to. All these laws, it's not necessarily to be afraid about being fined heavily or something like that. It's really coming down to having respect for your customers and the customer's data that they're trusting you with to handle for them. And therefore, of course, this is becoming more complex as well, because it's something that's very important to our customer. So those various frameworks, you want to make sure you have that under check, but normally, like I said, it comes down to minimizing risk for your customers' data at all times. And the fourth layer is the national laws. And everybody's talked a lot about Cloud Act and so forth. Really, the big one is FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Section 702, which is really allowing, in this case, we talk a lot about the US, of course, because the US is dominating our airways when it comes to cloud. That allows the US government to pretty much take any data that they want and do whatever they want with it as well. And Executive Order 12333, same there, right? So there's several laws that are going towards what Asmo was talking about, where it's in contradiction, not just with GDPR, but frankly against all laws. I mean, most of these laws, the very thing they want to protect is that that data does not get into the hands of people that shouldn't have access to that data. So just about all of those laws you break if you break GDPR and so forth, right? However, one should be very, very aware of, it's not just the US or China that has these laws, right? Frankly, in this case, the US does not have a privacy law at all. Some states do, like California, for example, and a little surprisingly, China actually does have a privacy law, right? So, but from both perspectives, there are laws that allows them to take the data that does not work with European law at all. And Europe, though, we have our own laws. Like, for example, I'm sitting in Sweden, and we have our own government agents, like FRA, for example. They also are looking to do various things. We shouldn't think that this is just a US or Chinese thing. I think citizens all over the world needs to stand up for those rights and make sure also that internally it's being adhered to, right? The difference, of course, is that we in the EU, we live and work in the EU, so we have to, of course, abide by the laws that we are adhering to here within Europe, so to speak. So if we take that, we can see that we have a complex situation. On the one hand, GDPR, I might have my vertical laws over here, and I got frameworks over there. All of these laws are of course touching each other in one way or the other. But really what it means is it means two things, and very simplified. This is a complex picture, but I'll talk a little bit about it because this is how we solve being able to work with the laws that are existing, but equally important to be able to be flexible and move, because there are new laws introduced, I was going to say all the time, not all the time, but quite frequently, surprisingly frequently, I would say. And it all comes down to the same thing again, various areas that we have not covered that the government wants to make sure that we do things right. So the laws, you can say two things that we need to make sure that we do right. One is the physical aspects of data, right? Somebody can, of course, come in and rob a bank, right? But they can also rob data physically, right? So the data center itself is extremely important. And just to have it said, your provider there needs to have control of that access, no matter how they do that. In our case, we go into billion-dollar type data centers, and there we take our own cages or rooms. And what's important for us then, and really for your provider as well, is to make sure that they have access. They are the only ones that have access, and that they can control that access. In our case, we do that with what's called dual custody. So there's actually two locks on everything we do. There's going to be two people that unlock that. And most of the time, any type of work that's being done needs to also be dual, so to speak, right? And having that final control is what makes a huge difference. Today, I would say Europe has a lot of data centers, and a lot of them are not up to par because the laws are coming on heavily here, and it means that it's not just the walls and the cages, it's also who is watching it and how often they're watching and how they're watching it to make sure that your physical presence, so to speak, is done in a proper way. Now, the other side is the logical side, and that's how we handle data. And that goes for example, for Klura, of course, but it also goes for friends. And you want to make sure that those organizations that you work with, that you actually hand over certain data, that they do that properly all the way in the chain. So that what we've done, you can see here, if you can see my mouth, we've chosen to do work according to various ISO certifications. And the ISO certifications are there for a number of reasons, right? We can, on the one hand, talk to a German or a Swede or a Finn or an American, and they will understand how we do our work. We also have proof in that work because we have people that come and check us every 3 months to make sure that we continue to do things the way they're supposed to be done. So, ISO works beautifully from a global perspective or a pan-European perspective. It's also done because we can adhere to new laws. So let's say the Security Act came here in June of last year, right? So a bunch of things changed, and we can go in there and say, okay, we add a check, we remove a check, we add a camera, we remove a camera, we do various things to be able to adhere to the next law and get that broad sense. We can also map new laws, each country has their own laws. Some are old and kind of obscure, right? But they're still valid, so people need to make sure that they can adhere to them. Then we can go in and map and say, out of these, let's say 700 checks that we have, do we include all the checks that we need to make sure that we can adhere to that law as well? So no matter what customers that we work with, whether it's friends or other, we can make sure that there's a broad adherence to laws. And that's a key aspect, in particular when you do integration work, because it's so broad. So friends and we sit down and we make sure that we can adhere to those laws that are within that segment of customers. So that's the whole ISO certification aspect. So that goes from the people that we use to work with, and that can, of course, when it comes down to military and so forth, that could even be citizenship and so forth, depending on the type of data you have. And if we follow the mouse a little bit here, so from the people to the data center, we make sure that we have the right type of ISO certifications, and those are categorized in 4 sections. One is ISO 9000, which is, of course, quality. Without quality assurance, you pretty much cannot adhere to much, right? Because you're going to fail at some point throughout the process. 14,000, of course, environmental. And 22301, we have something called is continuity management. And then we have a slew of what we call 27,000X, 27,001, of course, but a number of those. And that is where we regulate ourselves in the sense of how we handle the data. And that's where those checks come in for those laws to make sure that we do that properly. And if we then get the data center included in that, as well as the hardware and the software that comprises the whole cloud, then we build a chain, and that chain now allows us to guarantee that we're following through all the way around. And then, of course, having the auditors, and of course, our customers can audit us as well, but we have our own auditors from various external companies that make sure that we continue to follow up on this, but also improve, right? Because everything in life, of course, is usually maybe less of a revolution, but an evolution to make sure that you do things better and better and better. The other aspect that we do, and from a European perspective, is that everybody has an OSL law for government agencies, right? We look about once a year at Europe as a whole, and then we take a peek at which country has the toughest laws, right? Normally that over the last few years has been Germany. And when I say toughest, meaning like the hardest to implement. And we then use that as the lowest common denominator, because we know if we implement something according to, let's say, German law, then we know we can also do, whether it's Sweden, Finland, or Denmark, we can also make sure that those are covered, with a good margin. And the reason why that's is important, of course, is that, again, you look at integration, right? Maybe that integration comes with data from a government agency in Germany. Maybe that data comes from something else. And by looking at the lowest common denominator, we make sure that you can be transparent throughout Europe, whether it's Spain, Germany, or Finland. It doesn't so much matter. The only other thing I can touch upon in compliant cloud is, of course, that we look at a lot of financial services and that kind of stuff. So we take on normally things that go a little further. Many people might work with, let's say, and have heard of PCI DSS, which is a way for certain financial data to be stored. But we take that not only to PCI DSS, but PCI CPP, which is card production, where some of the highest level of financial data, for example, can be stored as well, right? And we try to do that in most of those types of verticals that have those types of rules. And again, of course, like Germany, of course, have BAF and BATE and BSI. We work with those quite a bit as well to make sure that we adhere to that. So I think that pretty much gives you an idea. You have the fiscal aspect, you have the logical aspect. You want to be able to map all those laws, and when you map them, you have an opportunity not to just adhere to them, but also be able to flow with those changes that are coming along. So I think I'll leave it there, and Asmo, maybe we take a few questions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Johan, and interesting stuff to say the least. I was barely able to keep myself quiet there while listening to you. But we do have a couple of questions here on the chat, and one of them appears to be someone who has probably visited your website and noticed that you do have services for the compliant cloud, which we were talking about now, but something called a public cloud as well. Could you maybe explain the difference there shortly?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually have 3 core services. Public cloud, which is very similar to AWS or Azure. The difference there is they have more functionality than we do, but the other difference is the regulatory. We can actually guarantee GDPR in our public cloud. So if you're in Frankfurt or say Stockholm, we guarantee GDPR, which none of the hyperscalers can do at this point. But that's also where it stops. There's certainly many other laws that can be within that. But if you want to go up, let's say you're a bank secrecy, or you're in healthcare, patient data law, as soon as you move up one step beyond that, you usually have a lot of things that come into play that are even more tricky to be able to deal with. So 6-7 years ago now, we decided that, okay, public cloud is great, and a lot of data can be kept in public cloud. But for all those with a little bit bigger regulatory challenge, we created compliant cloud. And what it is really same technical foundation. It's open source, it's OpenStack, Kubernetes, and a lot of other things that build up the functionality of the cloud. But we take the regulatory level much higher. It means even more checks. It means better cages. It means all those things that allows, for example, a bank to go there, or even a military outfit, for example, a defense contractor or something like that we can take it higher, so to speak, right? And then the third one is private cloud. And private cloud is really where large enterprise can do what they want with it. It's not just laws, but maybe also control of the data, where only that enterprise has it. So that's pretty much the difference.
Yeah, makes complete sense, and and a good explanation, I think, there. One other question that has also, of course, been on my mind as well is that, well, if we take a little bit of a look to the east of both Finland and Sweden, we see plenty of strange things happening, at least if we measure in the past couple of decades. But do you have any kind of comments there on does the current kind of geopolitical situation affect, I'd say, the hyperscalers somehow, or does it affect you, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, it's interesting. It's of course terrible what's going on right now in Ukraine and so forth, right? But it's interesting, and this is way before that geopolitical aspect. I think that we used to have a large focus on the laws, right? I think governments in Europe today are looking much more towards digital sovereignty. And digital sovereignty, I believe, will actually affect all of us. I think the laws that we just talked about will become more important, but also the control of data. And I think from a government perspective, all over Europe, we're also going to want to make sure that we have the capabilities. We've seen the issues with chips not being delivered, and I can't get my car, and that's becoming more and more serious. Now we're talking about the food supply, right? And I think digital is at the foundation of everything. If you want to make sure we have the right food, you also need to make sure that we can have the right digital infrastructure, right? It's like Europe having railway for trains. Of course, we're going to have, the infrastructure for digital as well, because it's affecting all of our society. So, from a company perspective, we're not hugely affected. We're taking our precaution, like I'm sure everybody else, including employees, but also some of the cybersecurity activity that's going on. But I would say this as a recommendation to anybody listening here is that invest early in cybersecurity and the things that protect you, because it will most likely become more volatile going forward. And of course, the laws is a part of that as well. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, I agree 100% with everything you mentioned there. And I think from my experience as well, this has been something that's kind of becoming more and more important to customers and clients that we meet. At least I meet every day, since I think it used to be like one of the, I would say, top 8 or 9th question or regarding all of this compliance and data protection. But now I think it's in the top 3. So maybe not the first one, but it's usually the second or the third question
But
that
let
you
me
have
add
to
to that,
tackle.
Asmo. Let me add
Yes.
to that, because frankly, we are all touching government somewhere, somehow, right? Some of us deliver maybe all of our services to government, but even if I don't deliver it to government, I am probably part of a chain. And one thing we all have to realize is that whether it's GDPR or patient data law or something like that, it all falls down with the chips, right? Meaning that, if somebody wants to be legal, that means I have to also do things right for them to be legal if I actually deliver services. So I think that this digital sovereignty and the geopolitical situation where control and laws will become more important, it becomes even more important for us as enterprises and companies in the private sector to be able to work with government. And they are going to become much harsher in their judgment as in how they want to see services being delivered. So make that change quickly.
Agreed. Excellent. Any other questions, or do you have any other questions for me, for example?
Well, listen. I was thinking here just before, right? I'm curious. We see integration as an extremely interesting area. Not only does every company need it, but one thing that you might know that I don't have as much information about is that we work with cloud, and a lot of things are going cloud, but not everything. This digital sovereignty thing might actually reverse that a little bit. At least you want to have control. So from an integration perspective, I find it to be interesting where it becomes more and more challenging, right? You have SaaS services there, you have cloud services here, you have on-prem there, which means that, from an integration perspective, it's kind of like all over the place, right? How do you see, well, two things. How do you see that moving forward? Is integration moving quickly towards cloud, or is it continuing to be a hybrid type of situation from integration perspective as well?
Well, a super interesting question to be honest, and one I get asked quite a lot. And to be honest, the way that I see it is that, and I'm gonna borrow your excellent quote there from the compliance part, where you said that it's basically all about transparency as well, and kind of governance and control, and having those processes in place. And I think that also applies to integration and from a technology point of view. So what I mean by that is that I don't see the kind of public cloud going away anytime soon. I don't see the traditional on-premise going away anytime soon, and I don't see the private clouds going away either. So I see everyone kind of stabilizing in this sort of a harmonious relationships, since you do obviously have benefits in, let's say, the on-premise environment that you wouldn't have in a public cloud, and vice versa. But what becomes extremely important in that case is the capability to be able to operate efficiently in all of those environments, and more importantly, to be able to manage and control what happens in which environment. And that's the key here, that we have those, let's say, more or solutions or use cases that require more compliance. So you had excellent examples, for example, from the financial sector or from the framework perspective, and so on. So not all of those, let's say, regulations or use cases apply to all of the data that we are processing for an organization, but they do apply, let's say, the majority of the data. So being able to do that, do the compliant thing, and operate within, let's say, that box or that framework or that law when you are dealing with that data becomes extremely important. And that's why I think we are seeing this sort of the rise of the hybrid, so to speak. So for example, quite typically, we might have all of our, let's say, employee data, like our production related data, financial data, the important stuff remains in the on-premise world due to security and all the reasons that you mentioned there. But let's say, for example, marketing data. So you are publishing ads or you have your website. Of course, that's still going to be in the cloud, and it's not going to be that's not going to change. But being able to be present in both worlds, the secure, compliant world, and then the, well, not less secure, but different public cloud world, and connecting those two seamlessly and being in the driver's seat on what happens where is where I think we are moving towards, and that's of course heavily what we're trying to do with the Friends platform as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I can see that for sure, and it's interesting.
Definitely. But okay, hey, I don't think there are any other questions posted on the Q&A section there, but this has been an extremely interesting discussion, Johan, and we'll definitely do this again sometime in the future, maybe from a little bit of a different perspective. But I think we could thank all of our listeners so far. And just as a final note, so obviously, if you're interested in either hearing more about Klura's offering, please contact Johan, and we will, of course, send the recording with appropriate links after the webinar here. And the same thing goes for Friends. So if for example, you'd like to hear more about the kind of Friends compliant cloud offering, please don't hesitate to be in touch with us. And again, we will send the recording to everyone who might not have been able to participate in the live webinar today. And I would like to thank from my side. Johan, do you have any final words from your side?
No, just saying thank you very much, and certainly we're in interesting time, so I'm sure we'll get a chance to meet up again.
Definitely. But all right, everyone have a great day, and we can finish the webinar now.
Thank you.